All right. The last thing we're going to look at in this section is a concept that adds just a little bit of subtlety to what we've been learning. So, what you see here may look like a pretty typical supply and demand diagram, but I've kind of changed something from the way I usually draw this. Maybe you already see it. If you don't, I'll show you what it is in just a second. So right now, this is our equilibrium. So this is our price and this is our quantity. Now let's say that we experience an increase in demand. So this is our D2. Now, on the one hand, we kind of see what we would expect to see. We do see an increase in price, okay? And we see an increase in quantity. Now, that said, do you notice anything? Hopefully you should notice that the increase in price is a lot more dramatic than the increase in quantity. We see this huge increase in price and this tiny increase in quantity. Well, why did that happen? Well, let's take a look back at our original graph. I promised I would point out what's weird about it. Well, what's weird about it? It's that this slope right here on the supply curve is really, really, really steep. So when we see big increases in price, we only see tiny, tiny changes in quantity. Let's look at another supply curve. And I'm going to make it weird in kind of the opposite way. And now let's do another increase in demand. So, yep. It's not my best work here, sorry. Now again, we see the effects that we typically see. Our price increased and our quantity increased. But you can see here that the increase in quantity was a lot more than the change in price. Just a little bitty change in price caused a huge change in quantity. So let's talk about what's going on here. So the concept that we need to think about is a concept called elasticity. And more specifically, price elasticity. So elasticity is how the quantity supplied or the quantity demanded changes based on a variable. Price elasticity is how much your supply or your quantity supplied or your quantity demand changes as price changes. If it increases by 5%, does the quantity increase by 70%? Does it increase by 0.5%? That's kind of the idea behind price elasticity: is how much does price change either quantity supplied or quantity demanded, depending on what we're talking about. Now, there's other types of elasticity. There's elasticity based on like distance, like, hey, if it's too far away, how much is that going to change how much I'm demanding or supplying at that distance. But for our purposes, we're mostly going to talk about price elasticity. So we can talk about elasticity of demand and elasticity of supply. Let's start with demand. So let's start off with something that is elastic. Now, if you want to think about what elastic means, think about like a rubber band, where if something is elastic, it moves a lot when you try to move it. If it's elastic, then a small change in price leads to a very large change in quantity. Now, you're thinking, okay, what kind of things would do this? Well, There's a lot of goods where we are very sensitive to changes in price, where we go, oh well, if I'm gonna have to pay that much for it, well, I'm just not gonna buy it. Or goods that we're accustomed to getting for cheap or for free. Imagine that video game on your phone, instead of charging nothing, um, jacked up the price to $1, and you're like, oh no, it's $1 more. Whereas, if the same thing happened at a car dealership, you know you're not freaking out as much, even though they've raised the price by $1,000. Okay. um, so if we are very sensitive to demand, this is called um, elastic. Okay, because it changes a lot. Now there's other things that work the opposite way. You'll notice this is almost vertical, whereas the other one was almost horizontal. And this demand is called inelastic. Okay. Now, inelastic demand means that it takes a dramatic change in price to even change quantity a little bit. Now, examples of inelastic demand are things that we kind of can't live without. This could be gasoline. This could be um, stuff that we're addicted to, like cigarettes or vape stuff. This could be healthcare. Healthcare is an example of this, because if someone says, "Okay, well, you need to pay, $1,000 a month for this insulin," it's like, well, I gotta take it, so I'm gonna pay $1,000 a month for it. So that's what's going on here, where it's going to take a dramatic price increase to even change quantity a little bit. So that's inelastic demand, which is going to, again, be stuff that's kind of necessities. A very easy way to remember what the graphs look like for inelastic versus elastic is inelastic demand looks kind of like the letter I, okay? Whereas the capital letter E has all these horizontal lines. So elastic demand looks kind of like this. Now, supply can also be inelastic or elastic. So inelastic supply would be something where they can't really make more of it, at least not in the short run. Um, or something like a sporting event where there's only so many spots, at the sporting event. Like at Cowboys Stadium, they actually can like squeeze some more people in by like putting in like smaller seats. But in general, sporting events, concerts, anything like that is going to be inelastic, because even if you're going to pay them a gajillion dollars, they can't cram more people in there. They've got this very fixed supply. Collector's items. Okay, there's only so much to go around if there's this fixed supply. So if demand increases on those things, quantity is not going to change. All that's going to change is um, where the price is, basically. Um, Elastic supply tends to be things where it's mass produced, but they're not at capacity. So they can make more, they can make less, depending on what they're um, what they're getting paid for it. So stuff like toys and um, a lot of times, anything that you're manufacturing not at capacity, that's where you're going to see elastic supply. why are we talking about this? Why are we talking about um, elasticity? Well, a lot of times, once you've studied supply and demand, someone says, "Oh, well, demand is increasing, so we're going to see higher price, higher quantity." Well, that's only half the discussion because maybe it's something where supply is very inelastic, where we're not really going to see a big change in quantity. We're only going to see a big change in price. Let me give you an example. So, one big um, debate that people like to talk about a lot is the minimum wage debate. So, let's say I've got demand for the labor and I have the supply. Now, minimum wage, what it often does is it puts the wage above the equilibrium wage. And we already kind of know what's going to happen here. We already know that, hey, the quantity supplied is going to be higher than the quantity demanded, and there's going to be this gap, and there's going to be unemployment. And so people will say, hey, the minimum wage is going to cause unemployment. And most economists would agree that to some degree that's correct. But what if supply and demand are both highly inelastic at this wage? Well, if we set this minimum wage higher, then we still see a little bit of unemployment, but the effect size is nowhere near what it was, in that other example. So by looking at elasticity, um, we start to see some more subtleties on like, hey, how much is the quantity changing? How much is the price changing? Um, when you look at healthcare, if you don't look at the idea that the demand for healthcare is almost completely inelastic, then you're not really having the right discussions because you don't see what's going to happen as supply increases or supply decreases. The idea that people are going to pay pretty much whatever you charge when it comes to healthcare. So that's why we're talking about elasticity, so that we can kind of have some more subtle arguments about what's going on here.